The community hall in the little town was buzzing with excitement. Every year, people gathered here for the annual talent show. It was not a grand event like those on television, but for the townspeople, it was one of the most important nights of the year. Children practiced dances, teenagers rehearsed songs with their friends, and adults prepared magic tricks, poetry, or comedy acts. Families came together to cheer, and the whole town waited eagerly to see what surprises would unfold on the stage. In the middle of all this excitement lived an elderly woman named Eleanor. She was 72 years old, and most people in town knew her only as the quiet lady who lived alone in a small house at the edge of Maple Street. Eleanor was a widow. Her husband, Harold, had passed away many years ago, and her children had moved to other cities with their own busy lives. She rarely came into the spotlight. She was kind, always greeting neighbors with a gentle smile when she went to buy bread or when she watered the flowers outside her gate, but few people knew much about her past. When the announcement of the talent show came out, a group of young contestants were joking among themselves. They wanted to make the event more entertaining and thought it would be funny if they convinced Eleanor to join. They whispered that it would be amusing to see an old lady try to perform. One of them, a teenage boy, approached her while she was buying groceries and said, "Mrs. Eleanor, you should sign up for the talent show. Everyone would love to see you on stage." His friends giggled behind him. At first, Eleanor hesitated. She had not stood on a stage in many decades. But there was a small flicker inside her heart, a memory of the days when she used to sing as a young woman. Back then, she had loved singing with Harold, who played the guitar for her. They would spend evenings together on the porch, her voice rising softly under the stars. It had been one of the purest joys of her life. After Harold's passing, however, she had stopped. Life had become quiet, and she never thought anyone would want to hear her again. Still, the teenagers seemed so insistent that she finally agreed. She did not know they were mocking her, nor did she imagine they expected her to fail. Instead, she thought maybe they truly wanted her to share something she loved. With a shy smile, she put her name on the list. Eleanor stood on the stage, her voice trembling as she reached the middle of the song. At first, when she had begun, there had been little giggles and whispers, but now the hall had grown quieter and quieter. People leaned forward in their chairs, listening more carefully. Her voice was not that of a young woman anymore, but it carried something deeper. Each note held the story of her years of laughter, love, and sorrow. Eleanor stood on the stage, her chest rising and falling as the last note of her song slowly faded into silence. The sound still seemed to float in the air even though her lips had stopped moving. For a second, she thought the hall had frozen in time. Then the weeks turned into months, and Eleanor's life continued to change in quiet but meaningful ways. She was no longer just the elderly woman who lived at the edge of Maple Street, watering her roses and walking to the bakery with her small cloth bag. She had become a symbol of hope, not only for her little town but for many others who had heard her story. People who had never met her now spoke her name with admiration, and her performance at the talent show was remembered like a legend. What surprised Eleanor most was how the children of the town responded to her. Before, many of them had barely noticed her as she passed by. Now, when she walked through the park, children ran to her, calling, "Mrs. Eleanor, sing us a song." Their innocent voices warmed her heart. Sometimes, she would sit on a bench, and the children would gather around while she hummed a soft tune or sang a short lullaby. Their eyes sparkled as they listened, and their laughter filled the air between verses. For Eleanor, those little moments were treasures. The teenagers who once mocked her became some of her strongest supporters. They carried guilt at first, but Eleanor's forgiveness had touched them so deeply that they changed. Some of them began visiting her house, bringing notebooks to write down lyrics of old songs. They asked her to teach them how to sing with emotion instead of just copying what they heard on the radio. "You don't just sing with your voice," Eleanor explained gently. "You sing with your heart. Every song should mean something to you." The young people listened carefully, realizing they were learning something they could never get from books or videos. Her story also continued to spread online. The video of her performance, which had first reached a few thousand viewers, now had millions. Eleanor did not even own a computer, but her grandson showed her the comments on his phone. "Look at this one, Grandma," he said one evening. Someone from another country wrote, "Your voice reminded me of my late wife. Thank you for giving me peace tonight." Eleanor read the words slowly, her eyes welling with tears. She whispered softly, "I never thought my little song could travel so far." One day, Eleanor received a letter from a well-known music foundation. They invited her to perform at a charity event in the city. At first, she thought it must have been a mistake. She had never left her town for something so grand. But her family and neighbors encouraged her. "You have touched so many hearts here," the mayor told her. "Now it's time to let the world hear you too." Nervously, she agreed. The event was held in a large theater with hundreds of seats, all filled with people dressed in their finest clothes. The stage was bigger than anything Eleanor had ever seen. As she stood backstage, she felt her old nervousness return. Her hands trembled, and her knees felt weak. She whispered to herself, "What am I doing here? I am just an old woman from a small town." But then she remembered the standing ovation at the community hall, the children's eager faces, and the letters from strangers whose lives she had touched. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "I'm not here to impress," she reminded herself. "I'm here to share my heart." When she stepped onto the stage, the bright lights almost blinded her. The crowd applauded politely, not knowing who she was. But the moment she began to sing, the theater fell silent. Her voice, though aged, carried warmth, sincerity, and soul. It rose into the high ceiling of the hall and settled deep into the hearts of the listeners. People leaned forward, some holding their breath, others wiping their eyes as they felt the story in her song. By the time she finished, the audience erupted in applause, just as her little town had done months earlier. Another standing ovation, this time in a grand city theater. Eleanor bowed, her cheeks wet with tears, overwhelmed by the love of strangers. After the performance, people came to her with handshakes and words of admiration. Some asked if she had ever recorded her songs. Eleanor laughed gently, shaking her head. "I only sang for my husband, long ago," she said. But now, with so many requests, she began to think about it. Not for fame, but so her voice could remain, even when she was gone. Her grandson helped her record a few songs at home, using simple equipment. They weren't polished like studio tracks, but they were real. When the recordings were shared online, thousands listened, and many wrote back with gratitude. They said her voice carried healing, reminding them of parents they had lost, of childhoods long past, of love that still lingered in memory. Eleanor smiled as she read those words. She finally understood that her gift was not meant to be hidden. Back in her town, she continued to live her life simply. She still tended her roses, baked pies, and sat on her porch in the evenings. But she was no longer the quiet woman who blended into the background. She was the town's pride, a living reminder that dreams could bloom at any age. Schools invited her to speak to children, and she always told them the same thing: don't ever laugh at someone trying. Don't ever think you're too old, too young, or too small to shine. Each of us has something inside us waiting for the right time to be shared. Her words stayed with the children. Many of them carried her lessons into their own lives. Some pursued music, others pursued art, and many simply learned to respect those who were older and to never underestimate quiet people. Years passed, and though Eleanor grew older, her spirit remained strong. She continued singing whenever she could, at festivals, at schools, at gatherings. People always listened, always clapped, and often cried. Her voice became the voice of her town, a melody of courage, forgiveness, and love. One summer evening, Eleanor sat on her porch, humming softly as the sun set. The roses in her garden swayed gently in the breeze. She thought of Harold again, as she often did. She felt him near, as though he was sitting beside her with his guitar, smiling at her with the same warmth he always had. She whispered, "I kept singing, Harold. Just like you wanted." And they listened. At that moment, she felt complete. Her life had not been wasted, her voice had not been lost, and her love had not been forgotten. She realized that the standing ovation was not just about applause. It was about being seen, being valued, and reminding others that beauty never fades, it only changes form. Her story became part of the town's memory, passed on from parents to children, from teachers to students. Whenever someone doubted themselves, people would say, "Remember Eleanor. Remember how she sang when no one believed in her, and how she moved the world." And so, the old woman who was once asked to sing as a joke ended up leaving behind a legacy of inspiration. She taught the world that courage could rise in the unlikeliest of moments, and that a single song, sung with truth, could echo far beyond the walls of any hall. On their feet. The following week after the talent show, Eleanor's life began to change in ways she had never expected. For most of her 72 years, she had lived quietly in the background, unnoticed by many except her closest neighbors. Now, after that unforgettable night, she had become the center of attention in the small town. Everywhere she went, people smiled at her, called her name, and praised her courage. When she walked to the bakery in the morning, the shopkeeper greeted her warmly. "Mrs. Eleanor, I saw you in the paper. You were amazing," he said, handing her a loaf of bread without taking a coin. "This one's on me," he added with a grin. Eleanor blushed, insisting she would pay, but he waved his hand. "No, no. You gave us something priceless. Let me give you this small gift." At the grocery store, strangers stopped her in the aisles. One woman said, "You reminded me of my grandmother. She used to sing like that when I was small. Listening to you made me feel like she was beside me again." Another man, who had never spoken to her before, told her, "I was having a hard time in life, but your song gave me hope." "Thank you." Eleanor listened with wide eyes, overwhelmed. She had never imagined her voice could touch so many hearts. The video of her performance had gone far beyond town. Her grandson, living in another city, called her on the phone, his voice bursting with excitement. "Grandma! You're famous! My friends are sharing your video online. They can't believe you're my grandmother." Eleanor laughed softly, feeling a mixture of surprise and joy. She had not even known the video existed until then. He explained how people from other towns, even other countries, had seen it and left comments about how her song moved them. Some had said it reminded them of their youth, others said it gave them strength in their struggles. At first, Eleanor didn't know how to feel. She had never cared for fame or attention. But what touched her most was the idea that her simple act of singing could give comfort and inspiration to strangers far away. It made her realize that music was not just entertainment, it was a bridge, connecting hearts across ages and distances. Meanwhile, the teenagers who had first mocked her carried their guilt quietly. One afternoon, as Eleanor sat watering her roses, a group of them walked hesitantly toward her house. They shuffled their feet, their heads bowed. The boy who had convinced her to join the show finally spoke, his voice low. "Mrs. Eleanor, we're sorry. We didn't ask you to perform because we believed in you. We just thought it would be funny." His friends nodded, their eyes filled with shame. Eleanor looked at them for a long moment, her heart soft. She could see they were sincere. Instead of scolding them, she smiled gently. "You know," she said softly, "if you hadn't pushed me to sign up, I might never have discovered this again. Maybe you thought it was a joke, but in the end, it became a blessing. So I forgive you." The teenager's eyes widened in surprise. They had expected anger, maybe even rejection, but instead she offered kindness. One girl whispered, "You're amazing, and tears welled in her eyes. From that day, those young people respected Eleanor deeply, and some even asked her to teach them old songs. Not long after, the town council invited Eleanor to perform again, this time not as a contestant but as a guest of honor. The mayor himself visited her, explaining how her performance had uplifted the entire community. "Mrs. Eleanor," he said warmly, "you reminded us all that age is not a limit, and that beauty can bloom at any time. We want you to sing at our summer festival." Eleanor's hands trembled as she accepted the invitation. She had never thought she would stand on a stage again, yet here she was, being celebrated instead of doubted. When the summer festival arrived, hundreds gathered in the park. Lights strung across the trees glowed softly, and the stage was decorated with flowers. Eleanor walked onto the stage with more confidence than before, though her heart still beat quickly. This time, however, there was no fear of laughter. Instead, there was excitement, trust, and love shining in the faces of those who waited for her to sing. She chose another old song, one Harold used to love. As she sang, the crowd swayed gently, some holding hands, others closing their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Children sat quietly on the grass, listening as though a story was being told through her melody. The applause at the end was just as thunderous as before, and Eleanor felt once again that she had given something precious to those who listened. Her fame grew beyond the town. Reporters from nearby cities came to interview her. They asked her about her past, her love for music, and why she had never pursued it professionally. Eleanor answered honestly, telling them about Harold, how she had once dreamed of singing on stages but chose a quiet life to raise her children and support her family. She spoke with no regret, only with gratitude for the chance to sing again now. One reporter asked, "Do you realize how many lives you've touched with your voice?" Eleanor shook her head, smiling humbly. "I never thought I had much to give. I was just a wife, a mother, and then a widow living alone. But maybe that's the lesson. We all carry something inside us, something that doesn't fade with time. Sometimes it just waits for the right moment to be shared." Her words touched many, and her story was printed in newspapers, shared online, and spoken about in schools as an example of courage and resilience. Teachers even told their students about her, reminding them not to underestimate anyone, not to laugh at others' dreams, and not to believe that age could silence talent. Back at home, Eleanor's life was still simple, but her heart was fuller than it had ever been. Her house was filled with letters from strangers who had seen her video. Some thanked her for reminding them of their parents or grandparents, others told her that her song had given them strength during hard times. One letter said, "I was thinking of giving up on my art, but after hearing you, I realized it's never too late to keep going. Thank you." Eleanor read each letter with care, her eyes often brimming with tears. She felt as though Harold was watching over her, smiling with pride. Every night, before going to bed, she whispered a thank you for the chance to sing again, for the love she now felt from so many, and for the lesson that her life was far from over. Her story became the town's pride, but more importantly, it became Eleanor's rebirth. The shy, quiet widow had stepped into the light and discovered that her voice was not gone. It was stronger than ever, carrying the weight of her years and the warmth of her soul. And as she sat one evening on her porch, humming the same melody she had sung on stage, she smiled at the stars. "Harold," she whispered, "I thought I lost my song when I lost you. But it turns out, you left it with me all along." The night air carried her tune softly into the world, and Eleanor felt peace knowing her voice had finally found its way home, not just to her, but to everyone who needed to hear it. She blinked in disbelief. It felt unreal. Just a few minutes ago, she had walked on stage shaking with fear, hearing whispers and soft laughter, and now the same people who had doubted her were clapping so loudly that she could feel the vibrations under her feet. Tears stung her eyes, and her hand instinctively went to her chest. She whispered softly to herself, "Harold, did you hear that? They clapped for me." The host returned to the stage, clapping along with the audience, his eyes shining. He leaned toward Eleanor and said into his microphone, "Ladies and gentlemen, wasn't that just breathtaking?" The hall erupted in cheers again. Eleanor bowed her head slightly, unable to find words. She tried to speak but only managed a shaky thank you. The crowd clapped even louder, as though to tell her she had no need to explain. Backstage, the younger performers were stunned. Many of them had been sure she would embarrass herself. Some had even joked about how funny it would be to see her stumble through a song. But now, they stood in silence, their hearts heavy with shame and their faces flushed with regret. A teenage boy whispered to his friend, "I can't believe it. She's better than all of us." His friend, who had been one of the loudest mockers, stayed quiet, staring at the stage with wide eyes. The judges, too, were deeply moved. One of them, a middle-aged man who had seen dozens of shows in his career, wiped his eyes with the corner of his sleeve. He had never expected such depth from someone so quiet, someone so overlooked. Another judge leaned into her microphone and said, "Mrs. Eleanor, you have given us not only a song but a piece of your soul tonight. Thank you." The audience applauded again. Eleanor finally walked off the stage, her legs trembling but her spirit soaring. As she stepped behind the curtain, people reached out to shake her hand. One woman said, "You reminded me of my mother's songs. I felt like I was a child again." Another man told her, "That was the most moving performance I've ever seen." Eleanor's cheeks glowed with warmth, and she smiled shyly, unused to so much attention. When she reached the dressing area, she sat down on the same folding chair she had occupied before her performance. But now everything felt different. Her heart was still racing, but it wasn't fear anymore, it was joy, pride, and relief. For so many years she had hidden her voice, believing no one wanted to hear it. Yet tonight proved that what was once locked away could still touch hearts. Meanwhile, in the hall, conversations buzzed. People were talking excitedly, replaying her performance in their minds. Some compared it to famous singers they had heard on the radio, others spoke about how her voice had brought them to tears. Parents leaned toward their children, reminding them gently that one must never underestimate anyone, no matter their age. Children nodded, their eyes still wide from the experience. As the show went on with other contestants, the mood had changed. Each act that followed was appreciated, but many in the audience still whispered about Eleanor. The teenagers who had been mocking her earlier now felt uncomfortable. Their laughter from before seemed cruel in light of what had happened. They had thought she would be weak, but instead she had shown strength they couldn't even imagine. Later that evening, when the intermission came, Eleanor walked quietly through the hallway of the community hall. People stopped her again and again, shaking her hand, thanking her, even asking if she had been a professional singer once. She smiled softly and shook her head. "No," she said, "I only sang with my husband. He played the guitar, and I sang for him. That was all." Her answer surprised many. They could not believe that such talent had been hidden for so long. In a corner of the hall, the group of teenagers who had tricked her into signing up sat in silence. They watched her surrounded by people who admired her. One of the girls bit her lip, her eyes filled with guilt. She whispered, "We wanted to make fun of her, but look at her now. She's the star of the night." The others nodded silently, their earlier laughter replaced with a heavy sense of regret. Back at her small house later that night, Eleanor sat in her quiet living room, her heart still full from the experience. She placed the little program booklet of the show on the table and looked at it with a smile. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel invisible. She felt alive, as though the years had lifted from her shoulders. She thought of Harold again, and for a moment, she almost heard his voice in her memory, "I told you your voice was special, my dear." She closed her eyes and whispered, "You were right, Harold. You were always right." But Eleanor's story was not finished. The news of her performance began to spread the very next morning. Someone had recorded her on their phone and posted it on social media. At first, it was just shared among townspeople, but soon others outside the town began to watch it too. Her voice touched people far beyond the hall. Comments began appearing under the video. "I'm crying, her voice is full of life, proof that age doesn't limit talent, this is the most beautiful thing I've heard all week." Eleanor did not even know at first that her performance was spreading online. She was simply enjoying the flowers her neighbors had left at her doorstep, and the warm greetings she now received from people she barely knew. For years, she had walked to the store quietly, unnoticed. Now, people waved to her, stopped her to talk, and even asked if she would sing again at the next event. Inside, Eleanor felt something new blooming in her heart. It wasn't pride in the arrogant sense. It was gratitude. Gratitude that her voice had not faded, gratitude that people listened, and gratitude that she had been brave enough to step on that stage despite the laughter she had feared. She thought about the young ones who had pushed her to join. At first, she had been hurt by their whispers, but now she realized something else. If they hadn't challenged her whether jokingly or not, she might never have stood on that stage. In a strange way, their joke had given her the chance to discover herself again. The days after the talent show felt like a dream. The local newspaper even wrote an article about her, calling her the heart of the night. She was surprised to see her own photograph printed in the paper, holding the microphone with her eyes closed, singing with her whole soul. The caption read, "Eleanor brings the crowd to tears." Neighbors knocked on her door, bringing baked pies and warm smiles, telling her how proud they were. And yet, despite all the attention, Eleanor remained humble. She still wore her simple dresses, still watered her flowers in the morning, still walked to the store with a little cloth bag. But now there was something different in her walk. She held her head a little higher. Her smile was brighter. Inside her heart, she felt like the young woman who once sang under the stars with Harold. She felt like time had given her a gift, one last chance to shine. That was only the beginning of what her song would mean for her, for the town, and for the people who once doubted her. Still, Eleanor felt nervous. Her hands shook as she held the microphone, and a small thought inside her kept saying, "They are laughing at you. They don't want to hear this." She dared not look at the audience, afraid to see faces mocking her. But then she remembered Harold again, her late husband, who always told her to never give up. His memory gave her strength, and she kept going. Backstage, the younger contestants watched too. Some were waiting for her to fail, ready to laugh when her voice cracked. But it wasn't happening the way they expected. Instead of breaking down, Eleanor was steadying herself more with every line. Her tone became clearer, her breathing calmer, and her voice began to rise with more confidence. A girl who had mocked her earlier whispered to her friend, "She's actually good." Her friend nodded slowly, unable to look away. Among the crowd, older people who had grown up with similar songs started to hum softly, recognizing the melody. The tune reminded them of a time long ago when radios played warm ballads, when dances were held in town halls, and when love letters were written on paper instead of through phones. They were pulled into nostalgia, and some smiled warmly at the sound. But not everyone was so quick to accept. A few of the younger boys in the front row still smirked, whispering between themselves. One even whispered, "It's still funny, she's just an old lady." Eleanor noticed their heads leaning toward each other, their grins wide. For a second, it almost broke her spirit. Her voice faltered, and the note came out softer than she meant. The silence in the room made the pause louder. Eleanor's chest tightened, and she thought about stopping. She wanted to run off the stage and hide. The humiliation she feared seemed just one step away. The audience waited, and in that waiting, she felt the weight of every eye on her. But then, from the very back row, a man's voice suddenly called out, "Go on, Eleanor. You can do it." It was Mr. Thompson, the town's retired music teacher, who had known her when she was young. His voice was warm, supportive, and it gave her courage. Eleanor took another deep breath and pushed forward, letting the next line come out stronger. This time, something shifted in the room. The crowd noticed the difference. Her voice had found its footing, and the words flowed with power. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It carried emotion that could not be faked. The whispers quieted, the smirks faded, and people began to truly listen. As she sang, Eleanor thought of Harold. She pictured him sitting in his old chair, guitar in hand, nodding to her as she sang beside him. She remembered the evenings when neighbors would pass by their porch and pause to listen, smiling at the simple joy of music. The memory filled her heart, and it poured into her voice. She was no longer just performing for a crowd. She was singing to Harold, to her younger self, to every dream she once had but buried. The children in the audience grew silent. The teenagers who had laughed earlier stopped leaning on each other and sat up straighter, their eyes fixed on her. Parents glanced at their kids, wanting them to see the lesson hidden in this moment that talent, beauty, and strength are not limited by age. When she reached the chorus, her voice swelled. It was strong, smooth, and carried across the hall. People were stunned. They could not believe this gentle old woman, who walked with slow steps and quiet manners, could command the stage with such presence. Even the host, standing to the side with a microphone, looked amazed. He had introduced her expecting a polite performance at best, but what he saw was something rare, a soul pouring itself into song. One of the judges, a middle-aged woman, blinked rapidly as her eyes filled with tears. She leaned toward another judge and whispered, "Do you hear the pain in her voice? Do you feel it?" The other judge nodded without speaking, unable to take his eyes off the stage. Backstage, some contestants began to feel guilty. They had whispered jokes before, but now shame tugged at their hearts. One of them whispered, "We shouldn't have laughed. She's better than all of us." The others stayed quiet, knowing it was true. Meanwhile, Eleanor herself felt transformed. The fear that had weighed on her was slowly lifting. With each note, she grew taller in spirit. Her posture straightened, her grip on the microphone steadied, and her face glowed with quiet confidence. The spotlight that had felt heavy before now seemed to belong to her. She was no longer hiding. She was shining. In the audience, a little girl tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Mama, she sings like a story." The mother nodded, tears in her eyes, and replied softly, "Yes, darling. She's singing her life." By the time Eleanor reached the final verse, the hall was completely silent. You could hear a pin drop. No one moved. Every eye was locked on her, every ear tuned to her voice. The atmosphere had changed from curiosity and doubt to respect and admiration. People who had come expecting to laugh were now holding their breath, waiting for each note. Then came the last line. Eleanor closed her eyes, let the memory of Harold guide her, and gave it everything she had left. The note soared higher than anyone expected, and it lingered in the air, full of power, before slowly fading into silence. For a moment, there was nothing. The room seemed frozen. Eleanor's chest rose and fell as she caught her breath, her heart pounding. She lowered the microphone, unsure what to expect. Would they laugh? Would they clap politely and move on? And then it happened. The silence broke with the sound of clapping, first soft, then louder. Someone stood up, then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire hall was on its feet, clapping and cheering. The sound filled the room, echoing off the walls, shaking the very floor. A standing ovation. Eleanor's eyes widened in shock. She covered her mouth with one hand, trembling, unable to believe it. The crowd cheered her name, some whistled, and many wiped their eyes. Even the teenagers who had mocked her before stood clapping, their faces red with shame but filled with admiration. Eleanor felt her knees weaken, but this time it was not from fear. It was from the overwhelming wave of love and respect that hit her. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she bowed slightly, her voice too choked to speak. For the first time in so many years, she felt seen. She felt valued. She felt alive. The host quickly came forward, his voice full of energy. "Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for Mrs. Eleanor." The cheering grew louder, and the applause refused to stop. Eleanor could hardly believe it. What had started as a cruel joke had turned into the most beautiful moment of her life. And though the show would continue with other performances, everyone knew this night already belonged to her. As the days passed, Eleanor practiced quietly at home. She pulled out her old songbook from a dusty drawer, the same one she used when she and Harold sang together. Her voice was not as strong as it used to be, but the emotion was still there. She stood in her small kitchen, humming softly while stirring soup, or sang aloud while tending her roses in the yard. She told herself that it did not matter if people laughed. All that mattered was that she was doing something brave, something for herself. Finally, the night of the show arrived. The community hall was packed with families, children, and neighbors. Bright decorations hung from the ceiling, and the stage was lit with colorful spotlights. The host, a cheerful man with a booming voice, welcomed everyone and announced that it would be an evening of fun, laughter, and surprises. One by one, contestants came forward. A little girl performed a dance in a shiny costume. A group of boys played guitars and sang a pop song. The crowd cheered and clapped for each act. Backstage, Eleanor sat quietly on a folding chair, waiting for her turn. She clutched the microphone with trembling hands, feeling her heart pound faster than it had in years. Around her, the younger contestants laughed and talked, sometimes glancing at her with amused expressions. She heard a few whispers. "Can she even sing? This is going to be funny," one voice said. Another laughed, "Wait till she opens her mouth." Eleanor lowered her eyes, pretending she hadn't heard. Her turn was approaching. The host announced, "And now, we have a very special performer tonight. Please welcome Mrs. Eleanor." The audience clapped politely, though some chuckled, expecting something awkward. Eleanor slowly walked onto the stage, her steps careful, her modest dress swaying gently. The spotlight shone on her, brighter than she imagined, making her feel both small and exposed. She looked out and saw rows of faces, some smiling kindly, others smirking with curiosity. For a moment, fear washed over her. Her mind whispered, "What if they laugh? What if I forget the words? What if my voice cracks?" She almost turned around to walk off the stage. But then another memory rushed into her heart, Harold's warm smile and his voice telling her long ago, "You have a gift, Eleanor. Your voice is made to touch people's hearts. Never hide it." She closed her eyes for a second, took a deep breath, and lifted the microphone to her lips. The hall grew quiet, waiting for what would happen next. Her voice trembled as she sang the first note. It was soft, uncertain, and shaky. A few people shifted in their seats. The teenagers in the front row grinned, already expecting the worst. But Eleanor kept going. She pushed past her nerves and let the song carry her. Slowly, her voice grew steadier, richer, and more confident. The melody floated into the hall, weaving through the silence. It was not just a song, it was her life, her memories, her love for Harold, her years of laughter and tears, all poured into each note. Though she stood there as a frail old woman, her voice carried a strength that silenced the whispers. The audience began to lean forward, listening more closely. Some who had been ready to laugh now sat still, eyes widening. A child in the back whispered, "She sounds beautiful." Even the teenagers stopped smirking, their expressions changing to surprise. By the second verse, the hall was completely silent, except for Eleanor's voice filling every corner. She sang as though Harold were there with her, strumming the guitar beside her. Her eyes sparkled with unshed tears, but her voice remained steady, filled with emotion. And for the first time in many years, she felt alive again, not just existing, but truly living. The song was still in progress, but Eleanor already sensed something different in the room. The silence was not mocking. It was respect, awe, and even admiration. Though she had come on stage thinking it was just a small-town simple event, at that moment, she realized she was sharing a piece of her soul with everyone present. And that was only the beginning.